Regardless of where you call home or where you plan to call home, there are positives and negatives, and especially when you are thinking about moving to another part of the world, there are a lot of pros and cons that need to be taken into consideration. In this episode, we're going to be talking about life in Europe. I'm Rafael Di Furia. Welcome to another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, and roll that intro. One of the cons, like just about almost everywhere else it seems these days, the cost of living has been going up and up and up. There are different reasons why it may be going up in one place over another place, but in Portugal there are various factors, and a lot of those factors have to do with how many people come and travel to this country, as well as how many people come and move to this country. Of course, with the tax incentives and visas changing, there are maybe a dip in the amount of people who are actually interested in moving to Portugal, where I currently call home. And even for people who genuinely enjoy living in this country, the cost of living has gotten to the point where it's made many people think about whether they actually want to continue calling Portugal home. And as time goes on, more and more expats are choosing to leave the country. But of course, there are many who decide to make the plunge and call Portugal home. But of course, when we're talking about living in Europe, generalizing and painting with a very broad brushstroke, there are still a lot of places that are inexpensive to call home. Of course, you have to think about why some of these places are inexpensive, and there are often reasons why some of these places are very low cost. And sometimes, for example, in the €1 houses scheme in Italy, it can often have to do with the location or lack of access to various different places. Not to mention hospitals, supermarkets, kind of essential, kind of basic things. Granted, in Italy, you can get away without a supermarket. And very often, going to a local greengrocer is the normal way of living your life. Going to a local greengrocer or butcher, just separate shops, not even just one-stop shopping. It's not uncommon, even if you are living in a major city. But even if you do decide to look at some of the more expensive countries around the continent, you can still find places that are lower cost. Of course, again, there could be reasons why some of those places could be lower cost. I mean, even safety could become a concern in some destinations where an individual who's maybe never been there might consider. But another major pro of living in Europe is the access to healthcare. The downside, the con, is the cost of that healthcare. But let me explain a little bit more what I mean. In Europe, when we're talking about healthcare, generally speaking, the access to socialized services is there. It's not that you will never be turned away. It can actually happen in some European countries, depending, say, for example, if it's a private hospital that you maybe don't have coverage to go to. This does exist. It's not that fully socialized healthcare doesn't exist, but fully socialized healthcare does come with some caveats and some things that you have to keep in mind. For example, the major con, the cost, and taxes as well as social contributions can be on the high side. And if you're a freelancer who, from a legal perspective, is self-employed, this actually can get really expensive really quickly. I mean, just this year alone, when it comes to social contributions, I've paid thousands already this year. And no, this is not even taking into account taxes that will have to be paid next year for this year. Granted, of course, if you have to go to a hospital in like the US, for example, tens of thousands of dollars can be very realistic to expect. So even though the medical systems across Europe are generally actually pretty good and pretty accessible, you do have to pay a lot to make sure that you have access to them. But the thing is, it's not to make sure that you have access to them, it's obligatory. But the one thing is that if you are going to be traveling around Europe and you are covered on a national healthcare system, that getting a European healthcare card to make sure that you're covered while in the European Union can be accessible to many people, and especially if you are working and paying into the social system. So for those emergency situations where you do maybe want to have a little bit of extra coverage just in case so you're not caught out, maybe it's worthwhile. But like I've said in so many episodes of Not Your Average Globetrotter, when talking about public health care in Europe, it is all of the fun and joy of going to the hospital with all of the complications that come along with going to the DMV. Or at least that's been my experience. Just before I get into the next section, I do want to say a huge thank you to those of you who helped to make these episodes possible through Patreon, the thanks button here on YouTube, as well as the one-time donations. All of the links are down in the more info section below. Also, thank you to those of you who've given this a thumbs up, or if you're listening to this as a podcast, who've given this 5 stars, as well as thank you to those of you who share these episodes with your friends. All of these different ways of interacting with this project, as well as leaving your thoughts down in the comments comment section below help the project in their own unique ways. But anyway, let's get back into the rest of the episode. But like I was mentioning about traveling around Europe with that health insurance, to get around Europe is generally quite easy. It is generally low cost, of course, not between all locations, and you have to plan it out decently. Sometimes you can get a last second flight that'll be cheap. I mean, finding flights between certain locations for, say, 15 to 100 euros, sometimes even round trip, is not unheard of. Granted, you will find trips where you'll have to pay 600, 700, 800. That does exist, especially if you're planning last minute during the peak seasons. And all in all, being able to get from one place to the next as easily as you can in this part of the world is really amazing. And it's a great way to gain different life experiences and learn about cultures and places and food. Most importantly, the food. Of course, it's not your average globetrotter. We have priorities here, and food is at the top of that priority list. Without food, nothing else happens. Think about it. However, there is actually a downside to all the travel that you do find in Europe. If it were just within Europe, travel from people who live here, who are here already, and that's it, then okay, that's one thing, and you would have a lot of very busy destinations. But seeing so many people from around the world choosing Europe as their travel destination can make it difficult for people who call some of these wonderful destinations their home. I mean, look at all the protests that have been going on in Spain recently, and having cheap flights and cheap buses. And when it comes to buses, those can really be cheap. Trains, not as much. Depends on what country you're in and depends on if you have to travel internationally or not. But with all of that access, that ease of access to travel can come with some over-tourism. And of course, we see over-tourism, the effects of over-tourism in places such as Venice, where it is now basically just for tourists. And the actual number of people who are living there are becoming fewer and farther between. And you see a lot of destinations around Europe. I mean, let's talk about Lisbon. I often talk about these places, but it is really becoming such a problem that so many apartments are being turned into Airbnbs. And there are so many different apartments in all of these cities that have been even just chopped up from one like family apartment into smaller single room hotel rooms, sometimes with a shared bathroom. That's one thing. If you're looking in Europe, especially if you're looking for a place to stay, booking.com, and you want a private bathroom, you need to make sure you select that option. And even to make sure that even if you do have a private bathroom, that it is either directly attached or within your room. Unless that type of thing doesn't matter to you, but even there are options where you might have to leave your room. The bathroom still could be private, but might not be in your room. And also, one of the reasons why there can be so much over-tourism in so many different destinations around the continent is because so many people in Europe have their vacation time for a very long period of time, like say end of July through the beginning of September, and everybody kind of takes their vacation time all at once. So even getting things done during that time of year can feel, or even be, near impossible. And even when I was in the process of getting my Italian citizenship, I had a rough idea of when the process could potentially be finished. And I was thinking maybe it could be June, but it came to be that time of year. And I was thinking, well, if it's not June, then it's probably going to be at least through the middle of September. If it's not going to be through the middle of September, then maybe November. And if it's not by the end of November, then maybe February. Who knows? There are certain times of year when things often slow down or just completely shut down totally. So yes, I am talking about citizenship here, but kind of take what I'm talking about, these time frames, and look at when things might be busy and why they might be busy, like holidays, vacation times, summertime, that kind of stuff. But focusing on not international travel, but local travel, needing a car in many cities is really not necessary at all. Granted, for many people, they may want to have one, but if you are living in a major city or even a smaller city, owning one and parking that car could be very difficult and very, very expensive to do so. Having a parking spot that comes with your place is not a guarantee. And even here in Braga, I know many people who live in the center of the city who use the public lots that are available here and just pay for them on a monthly basis because they don't have parking in their building. And it's not impossible to get used to a more pedestrian lifestyle, or biking or scooters, whatever it may be, or even public transport. In some parts of Europe, it can be very, very cheap. Or ride-sharing apps and taxis. Just depends on how far you're trying to go, where you need to go, and how urgently you might need to get there. For example, there are many places around the continent where, say, you could be living in a city and you can have access to either a supermarket or, like I said before, a greengrocer, a butcher shop, a fishmonger, office supply store, clothing stores. Instead of having one giant one-stop shop like a Walmart or the red-ringed Target boutique, you might not have those same type of single-stop options, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And it can be interesting to also get to know where you live a little bit better and maybe explore a bit more, because maybe you'll even start to have the option to compare different greengrocers. I like the vegetables from here because they're more fresh on these days, or maybe this guy has better tomatoes and this one has better strawberries, or this has this and this has this. Granted, it can get a little annoying at times to have to figure those things out, but the good thing is you'll often have options. Unless you're in a tiny village, then sometimes you'll just have like one or no options. I will admit, I don't understand why so many people look at moving from the US to the middle of nowhere in a tiny little village. Sounds fun, sounds amazing, but it's not my lifestyle. And even with that said, I don't judge people who do look for that lifestyle. But when we're talking about, again, going back to cars, if you are wanting to live in a smaller village, you'll definitely need one. If you are looking to kind of get into that more European city vibe, a car, not so necessary. Maybe even better not to have. But if you are looking for small village life in Europe, then having a car is an absolute necessity. And if you are wanting to explore actually smaller villages and smaller towns, or maybe even places that might not be on the main public transportation lines, a car would be very necessary to have. Just make sure that you keep in mind the cost of fuel and insurance, and sometimes you may have to pay for the use of roads in this part of the world, and even in places like Italy, for example. Private highways and controlled traffic zones are definitely a thing. But of course, one of the reasons why many people are looking to move to Europe is because they're looking for a particular lifestyle. Granted, some people are just looking for a different option for their work, and maybe they're getting moved out to who knows where for a job with their company that they need to be based somewhere. But even some people who are being transferred for their job are looking at Europe because of the difference in the lifestyle. And it really is wonderful to be able to call a country home where the lifestyle lends itself towards living life and not just towards grinding away and working all the time. Granted, even in some of those countries where that is maybe more the lifestyle, where you kind of enjoy life a little bit more, you might still find areas where it is all about the grind and just work, just like that one song from Rihanna. And even though there can be some really wonderful aspects of the slowness of the lifestyle, like I've also talked about so often, is that sometimes that slowness comes not just in one part of your life, but it can also come in bureaucracy to maintain this amazing slowness in your life and slowing down. In some ways, there are some really wonderful aspects of being able to slow down, just enjoy, go to a cafe, have a glass of wine, or go to the beach, whatever it may be. But sometimes you really are forced to make sure that you slow down because there's no other option, because the bureaucratic systems that you find across the continent are just going to start getting in the way and act as hurdles that you'll have to jump over. Granted, you'll have bureaucratic hurdles everywhere, but there are sure a lot of them in Europe. But sometimes I do wonder if that bureaucratic system of trying to get things to run at least at some level of smoothness, even if they don't feel smooth, is maybe what maintains that level of being able to slow down and enjoy life more. Who knows? Many people are attracted to the wonderful cities that are all across the European continent, and they are sometimes very wonderful places not to just vacation, but also to call home. But of course, when you are looking at some of these places to live, with how over touristed that these places have become, it becomes difficult to think of these places as home. And even like the city that I live in, Braga, Portugal, there's a little bit of tourism here, but there gets to be a point where a level of tourism just becomes maybe a little bit beyond what is comfortable to have to work around on your daily life. And all of those candy shops that just pop up around European tourist centers where they have those giant gummy candies and marshmallow candies that are completely overcharged, that you could go to the supermarket and buy almost the same thing for a fraction of the cost. Once you start seeing those, and then people dressed up as gladiators, you know, you've got something to worry about. Not just gladiators, but I remember even being in Poland, and I was there on a work trip with someone else, and a knight came over to us. It's not just the gladiators you have to worry about, it's the knights coming over with their swords, asking for money or offering to take a picture of you. And then maybe, for example, they take that picture and then they don't want to give you your phone back until you give them money. These things happen. I mean, if you're a tourist, keep an eye out for those. Don't trust. And in some places, it's not even allowed and technically illegal. So of course, if you are traveling around Europe, keep an eye open for those random individuals outside of those tourist hotspots who may be wearing some type of costume of some sort. Anyway, I'm Rafael Di Furia. Thank you all so much for joining me for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, as well as a huge thank you to those of you who help to make these episodes possible on a monthly basis. All of the links are in the more info section below this episode. And also thank you to those of you who are subscribed, who have hit the like button and share these episodes with your friends. I'm Rafael Di Furia. Stay safe and healthy out there, and I will see you all next time for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Later.